Good morning, everybody. Morning. Welcome to New York Law School and to our City Law Breakfast. I'm Ross Sandler, Professor of Law here at New York Law School and Director of the Center for New York City Law, and I welcome you to these wonderful facilities. Today is an extraordinary day. I was looking back at some of my old papers and I realized that it's been 40 years since the Knapp Commission issued its report. So I went out and I rented Serpico and I rented Prince of the City. And I must say they didn't do justice to either Nick or to Mike in the movie. But these were really important events in the city of New York. And those of us who were there remember them, and those of you who have studied them know that much pivoted on the Knapp Commission and what came out of that effort at police integrity. And so I thought it would be wonderful if Mike would come and talk to us about the Knapp Commission, and he agreed to, so we're really delighted to have him here. I'd like to say that among his other attributes, he has many friends, and a lot of them are here, many of them who were with Mike in the U.S. Attorney's Office back in the 1960s, or worked with them thereafter. Nick Scalpetta is here. Nick. Paul Rooney, who was a great prosecutor during that period. Duke Luttinger, another great prosecutor from the Morgenthau era. Frank Turkheimer, who is also teaching here as an adjunct. Gorman Riley, who is with me as an assistant U.S. attorney. Andy Schaefer, who is currently the Deputy Commissioner for Legal Affairs at the Police Department. Glad that you're here. And Rick Schaefer, his brother, who was counsel to Mayor Koch and is now counsel to CUNY. Bob Tierney, who is at the Landmarks Preservation Commission Chair. Glad to see you here. Kathleen Grimm, Deputy Chancellor, who is a faithful attendee and a member of the board of New York Law School, and we're delighted that you're here. It says something, Mike, about the interest. Oh, I mentioned Duke, Alice. Thank you. There are other people currently deeply involved in these issues in the Kings County and Queens County District Attorney's Office. We welcome you here, and from the Law Department. So this is an audience of people who are sophisticated about the subject and in many ways following in the work of the Knapp Commission and what it did to and bring a sense of police integrity to the department. Mike Armstrong, a Harvard Law graduate, Assistant United States Attorney, 1962 to 1967 under Robert Morgenthau, Chief of the Securities Fraud Unit. He was Chief Counsel to the Knapp Commission, as we all know. District Attorney in Queens County, Counsel of New York Urban League, Chair, currently Chair Commission to Combat Police Corruption. A great trial lawyer. What is interesting about Mike, among other things, many things, is that he has really blended an absolutely top private practice with public service. And that's one of the things that makes him so extraordinary. So I am delighted to welcome to this podium my friend and distinguished lawyer, Mike Armstrong.
Thanks, Ross. You forgot to mention the chief contact we had, which was playing touch football against each other many, many years ago. If you mention Duke, then I don't have to. Is that right? Thank you all for having me back to reminisce a little bit about things that were a long time ago. 40 years, it's hard to realize. But things have a way of kind of coming around, and I think that some of the things that happened all that time ago are still relevant. For those of you who weren't born at the time when this happened, the Knapp Commission got going on April 25th, 1970, when a New York Times story on the front page of the New York Times and stretching to the back told the exploits mostly of a police officer named Frank Serpico. And it alleged that there was corruption in a plainclothes unit up in the Bronx to which he belonged, and that he had taken this news to the top brass in the police department because he had a friend, an Amherst graduate friend named David Dirk, who had connections, and took it to the top of the police department and also to the Department of Investigation and also to the mayor's office itself, to Jay Kriegel, who was the mayor's chief aide, and that nothing had been done about it. The mayor at that time was John Lindsay, who was the Republican answer to John Kennedy. He was a tall, handsome, charismatic fellow with his eye on the presidency, really. And he couldn't stand this kind of publicity, so he set out to meet it. And after a couple of starts in other directions, he wound up appointing Whitman Knapp, who was a Wall Street lawyer with a background as a assistant district attorney under Dewey and Hogan, as chairman of a commission that included, there were 5 of them, that included Cyrus Vance Sr., who later became Secretary of State, and Frank Thomas, who became president of the Ford Foundation. And they asked me to be chief counsel to run the thing, and I assembled a group of 5 lawyers to help me, 2 of whom are here today, Paul Rooney and Nick Scopetta. Pardon me. And we got together a bunch of 12 investigators from the federal ranks. We borrowed investigators from the IRS and the Postal Authority and Narcotics Bureau, who would lend them to us for a period of months, and then we also had former FBI agents. We didn't want to get any local cops because we felt that there might be a loyalty problem. And then we set out to investigate the 32,000 people in the police department, kind of looking around and saying, now what do we do? Facing what then was the absolute settled truth that there was a blue wall of silence and that no cop would ever talk to you. I had people tell me I shouldn't take the job because the only way you're ever going to do it is by getting a crooked cop to turn and talk to you, and they said, no one, you'll never do that. But we started off and we stumbled a bit at the beginning, as I'm sure Nick and Paul remember, and got into some kind of some silly things and some things that didn't, some alleys that didn't come up with much. And then finally, after a lot of dead ends and some successes that turned into not successes, like when Nick persuaded this Bob Lucy, who was a detective in narcotics, to tell us what he knew, but then we decided it was too good to be true, and we had to turn him over to the feds to make cases, because it wouldn't be a good idea to blow him in a hearing. So great, we had this, and not only did we have to give up Lucy, but we had to give up Nick and the 2 agents who were working with him. So I figure that if my tribe is correct, I'm going to get time off in purgatory for that one. Then in the summer of '71, we got lucky, and through a Weasley little informant by the name of Teddy Ratnoff, who was then participating in making a book about a prostitute by the name of Zavera Hollander, ultimately winding up as the happy hooker. We got into a guy named Bill Phillips, who was a thoroughly corrupt police officer, and we, using Ratnoff as an intermediary, we caught Phillips, and we had all kinds of film tapes, and actually films, because we had a deal with a local TV that people, that they would take pictures and then give us the pictures and not ask any questions, and then later on when we used them in our hearings, they would get the outtakes, and they were fine with that. So we had pictures and films of Bill Phillips taking bribes and talking and all this kind of stuff, and then there was a dramatic confrontation where they tried to pat him down, and he was revealed, and then he came and worked for us for 3 months, taking more information, and it really was an in, the kind of in that we thought that we would never get. Turns out that a cop caught under those circumstances will talk, just like anybody else. We actually had 5 of them that, under different circumstances, talked to us about what was going on. 5 cops involved in corruption. We also had a young police officer named Ed Droge who came forward. He represented the not the super thief that Phillips was. So what we found in the little more than a year investigation that we had was, first of all, the blue wall was a myth. You can break down cops. Secondly, there was a pervasive fog of corruption that just really lay over the whole department. It was, Frank Serpico had a quote at that time, which I thought was very, very wise. I've quoted it ever since. He said, 10% of the department is absolutely corrupt, and 10% of the department is absolutely honest. And the other 80%, they wish they were honest. And that had a lot of wisdom to it, because the attitudes in the department were such that people lied about doing corrupt things that they didn't do, just to be one of the boys. People like Serpico, who were consciously and openly honest, were really out of it. Another cop that we later that testified for us later on said that he went in on a fire once, where they went into the firemen and the cops went into a not terribly serious fire, but in some store, and everybody stole everything. And he said he took a shirt, and it wasn't even his size. It was just, you did it. Incidentally, the cops always told you, you look at us, look at the firemen. Said the best anti-corruption device that you can make. Sorry, Nick. The best. That's what I told them. At that time, Nick. At that time, that was before your influence, and it was a. They were divided. There was a guy named Sidney Cooper. Sidney Cooper was the mentor of Frank Serpico, and he was a tough, bald-headed guy. He looked like Kojak, and they said that when he was a sergeant, he'd steal a hot stove. Now he was head of the internal affairs and was very, very tough about it, and was really quite a character. And he divided the corrupt police officers into what he said were meat eaters and grass eaters. And the meat eaters were the crooks. These are the guys who, serious corruption, covered up serious corruption. And the grass eaters were the 80% that Frank talked about, the 80% that wished they were honest, that kind of went along and did kind of just what came along. And what came along came in 2 forms, really. There were pads and there were scores. The pads were organized pickups of graft that in its quintessence was what Frank Serpico had run into in the plainclothes division in the Bronx, and that was the plainclothesmen, of whom there were 450 in the department, spread around in divisions around the department, were charged with the responsibility chiefly of seeing to it that they enforced the gambling laws against the bookmakers and the numbers rackets and things like that. And what they did instead was spend all their time collecting money from these people. And they organized it such that people went around and collected money on a regular basis. It was all put into a pot, and then at the end of the month it was divided up on a share basis. Each one of the plainclothesmen had a share, and the supervisor had a share and a half, and whatever was in the pot was divided. And the shares were valued at different values depending on what division you were in. In mid-Manhattan it was $400 or $500. Harlem it was $1,500 per share per month. And in those days, understand, a dime would buy roughly what $1 would buy today. And when one of these guys, one of these plainclothesmen would leave, well, when they got there, it took them 2 months to check them out. So they didn't get their share during the first 2 months. But you made up for it on the tail end, because when you left, you got 2 months severance pay. So it was that well organized as a really organized pad. There are also less centralized, more informal pads where it was understood that a particular thing going on in the precinct or in the division would pay, but it would pay to the local cop who would come by, and whoever happened to come by would collect the money. They also incidentally had what they called a known gambler file, which was intended to tell you who were the known gamblers that you could arrest, and instead, of course, it told you who you could get money from. The informal kind of pads included, we found construction sites, for instance. At that time, probably still today, I don't know, you could not build a building in the city of New York legally. You just couldn't do it. The regulations were so strangling that you can't, you have to have so much bricks on the sidewalk, too many, you can't have this. So Bill Phillips told us that he'd walk onto a construction site and just go like this. He'd just go like this, and the timekeeper would know he's talking about blowing dust. And blowing dust was a violation. He would reach his pocket, give him some money, and Phillips would go away. But that would be a kind of a pad that would be paid for just by whatever cop happened to come by. Bars and restaurants were another example. The regulations, of course, were myriad, where after hours, minors, crowding, etc., and cops would go to the bars and pick up. They also would every once in a while pick up what was called a flute, and a flute was a Coca-Cola bottle filled with liquor, which was a particular kind of benefit that would be given to them. Also, prostitutes were an obvious means of revenue. The Sabbath laws, which then existed, caused pickups, particularly from the Spanish grocery stores, the bodegas, which who would stay open on Sunday and wanted to be able to serve what they wanted to serve. The garment industry, peddlers, there are all kinds of things. Wherever there was something going on that violated some law or regulation and had to in order to survive, the cops would go by and take their share to see to it that they were allowed to continue. The other thing was the way that money was collected was through scores. And that's individual targets of opportunity on an irregular basis. This is where the narcotics payoffs chiefly existed. They would range from hundreds of dollars to hundreds of thousands of dollars. The largest one we ran into was an $80,000 payment in connection with a narcotics deal. Bob Lucy, in his work later on with Nick, discovered how this really got fine-tuned, and he told us about that as well. They would take, for instance, put in illegal wiretaps on organized crime people and find out where they were going to have a meet, and then they would show up. And there would be a lot of narcotics and a lot of money, and they would take both, and in exchange for letting the people go. Now, these guys were the real meat eaters. These people in this narcotics area and other similar areas. These are real crooks. There were others that weren't quite so bad. We located a couple of junkies by the name of Tank and Slim. They were a couple of teenagers who we never did know their names. I'm not sure whether they did. But they would steal merchandise to order in exchange for heroin given to them by this division, the 6th Division. And the cops would say, well, I'm having a party next week. I need 3 scotches and 2 gins and whatever, and they would go out and they would steal all this and bring it in, and they'd get heroin as a thing. But at one time, one of the cops wanted a mini bike, and so they went out and got it for him. We wired these guys up and got these cops giving their orders. It also got as serious as a murder. Phillips told us about a cop he had talked to who had told him about shaking down a murderer, an organized crime guy whom he knew had committed this murder. And we sent Phillips back to the guy and tell him, say, look, you know, they got an investigation going on. They're reawakening that case, and I think I can take care of it, but you got to tell me, what was that again? And so the guy tells the whole story about what happened, and it goes in the wire, and later on it resulted in both the cop and the murderer getting convicted when we were all done. And other scores would be, of course, the auto violation, the guy who puts the $20 bill in his wallet as he shows you his license. There was a tow truck violations where the cops would direct a tow truck to a scene and then take money in exchange for the tow truck getting the business. They would take money on DOAs, dead on arrivals, or dead people at a scene. Some cops would go through the pockets of the dead people. They had payoffs in connection with the retrieving of stolen automobiles. Again, on the score basis, wherever there was a situation where you could bring some pressure, we found that there were cops willing to take advantage of it. Now, all of these guys started out, we thought, pretty much all of them, started out idealistically. They came onto the job with an idea that they were going to be public servants. As well, it's a job, I mean, but the slide that we heard of was really typical. This fellow, Ed Droge, told us about his first night out. He was out with what he called an old hairbag, a guy who had been around for 15, 20 years. And they were on a street out in Brooklyn some night at 1 o'clock in the morning, and a car went careening by and crashed into a telephone pole about 3 blocks away. And Ed ran as far as he could down to be of assistance. And the old guy flagged down a car and rode down to where the accident took place, and gets out, and this guy gets out of the car, and it wasn't too bad an accident, and somewhat blearily says, he's obviously drunk, says, look, officer, there's no harm done. He takes $10 out of his pocket, and he gives the $10 to the old cop. And Ed said he just sat there and watched, and the cop said, all right, take off, buddy. And the guy took off in his car, and they walked away, and the cop took $5 out of his pocket, and without saying anything, just handed it to Ed. And Ed said that he didn't want the money. He thought that they should have arrested the guy, but what was he going to do? And that was the start for him. The standard narcotics story is, you heard it over and over again, about the way you make a case in a narcotics case is by an informant. And the informant, you got to either catch him doing something illegal or you got to pay him. And if you pay him money, most of these guys are junkies. If you pay him money, he's going to go out and he's going to spend it on junk. So why not cut out the middleman? When you make an arrest and you get enough narcotics on a guy to make felony weight so you can make the case, put a little in your own pocket, and then you take that heroin and you give it to your informant in exchange for information. And in your own mind, you're not doing anything wrong because you're not affecting the case that you took the junk in, and you give it to this guy. He's going to buy junk anyway. And then you keep doing this, and after a while you realize you're giving him more junk than he can really use, and you realize that what he's doing is he's selling it. And then it's a step from there to say, well, if he's selling it, I need a few bucks, and you take your share, and you are in the junk business. You are a drug seller, and you've gotten that way from an original idea of trying just to make cases. Sid Cooper told a story to people who got a little holier than thou about corruption, just to explain the way things can get a little complex. He didn't mean that, well, he said, imagine you're a sergeant and you have 5 or 6 people working for you, and you get an informant who is an organized crime informant. And this guy cannot be revealed. You can't bring him out at a trial. He can't be a witness. But he tells you that I don't know, George Lombardozzi is organized crime figure is going to steal personally a truck from a particular yard in Brooklyn at 2:30 in the morning on Wednesday. And so you say, okay, you get your people, you get around, and at 2:30 in the morning, around in the yard, this shadowy figure comes out from the dusk, and you can't see who it is, but he comes out and jumps in the very truck that you have been alerted to and drives off. But he knows an exit that you don't. He gets out of the yard, and he's out in the street, and he's down the street. And so you go after him with sirens and chasing the guy. 3 or 4 blocks down, you find the truck empty. Nobody in it. You go fan out, and 4 or 5 blocks away, walking down the street at 2:30 in the morning is Lombardozzi. So you grab him, you throw him up against a wall, and he just reaches in his pocket and takes out a $1,000 bill. He says, let me go. Now, you were being asked to take $1,000 for doing your job. You'd have to commit a crime in order to make a case against this guy, because you'd have to put him back in the truck. You'd have to say, I caught him in the truck. Because if you don't put him in the truck, you haven't got anything on him that would stick in a case. So you're there, you got a mortgage, your wife is sick, your kids need to be educated, and this guy has got a pocket full of $1,000 bills that he got from prostitutes and drug dealers, and he wants to give one to you for you to do your job. Now, what do you do? Now, we don't know what you should do, but as Cooper said, it makes you feel a little bit more sympathetic for people who might give in. The sense of humor that cops bring to their job and to everything was illustrated by 2 friends of mine who were cops who, when told that story, one of them said, I know what I'd do. I'd take the $1,000 and then I'd put them back in the truck. And the other guy said, and you never know what might be in the truck. So but it was, I mean, that's the lighter side, but the way it described better than I could by Ed Droge. He wrote a book, and he said this, describing what he had come to. He said, I was taking money as routinely as a bus driver accepting a fare. Not a lot of money. It would not make me wealthy. Pin money spent superficially, and that made it all the worse. There was no dire need, it was just there. Mostly the people offered and everybody took. I had become cruel and ruthless, slithering in the gutter, awaiting my next score. It was not just me, it was all around me. The system was such that it engulfed everyone. It did not discriminate. The light dawned the day my son said, you're a policeman, Daddy. I want to be one too. The thought of my son becoming what I had become sickened me. Now, how did the brass treat all this? The guys who were running the department, they had a standard way of handling it and handling graft, and that is to say, it's a few rotten apples in a barrel. By focusing on the rotten apples, you didn't have to worry about the barrel. They fought the idea that there was any kind of a systemic problem. Commissioner Murphy, who was a reform commissioner, illustrated the pressures that lead to this kind of an attitude when in the middle of our hearings, when Bill Phillips was testifying, on the 3rd day of his testimony, Murphy got on the cop radio and called him a rogue cop and said, why should we suffer from the testimony of this? Yeah, of course he was a rogue cop. That's what he was testifying about. But the implication was that you shouldn't believe him. Murphy knew better, but he had this pressure to go with what all of the brass always had gone with, and that is that it's just a few rotten apples. The primary purpose of the brass was to protect the image of the police department. John Walsh, the first deputy commissioner, testified at our hearings. He was a ferociously anti-corrupt cop. He was in charge of, he was first dep, but he was ferociously anti-corruption if you got caught red-handed. But if you didn't get caught red-handed, then he didn't want to hear about it. And he said that if there was a large investigation involving drugs, organized crime, everything, and you found a corrupt cop in there, I asked him, what would you do? Would you arrest the cop and blow the investigation? Or would you let it go and see how far it went. He said, I'd arrest the cop. Now, of course, he said you can't have a guy with a gun and a badge who's corrupt out on the street. And of course, the other effect of that is it cuts it off before you find any other corrupt cops. We found several indications also of the way the brass treated this. They were the Federal Bureau of Narcotics had some reports that we found about corrupt police officers. One, a 14-month investigation from in 1968 on, and was turned over. There were 69 cops, and nothing was ever done about it, as far as we could tell. There was another on April 30th, 1970. A couple of federal inspectors, and they had their own problems, incidentally, met with the chief of the narcotics division to tell him about the corruption on the part of 9 people, and nothing was ever done. And then in the files of the Internal Affairs Division of the department, we found a request from the Bureau of Narcotics to the department to help out in an investigation of joint corruption of feds and cops. And the request was never acted upon, and the chief made a note on the report saying, I want to get our men out of that. And then he said, the first deputy commissioner doesn't want to help the feds lock up local police. Let them arrest federal people. Well, that was the attitude of the brass that led to the condition that we saw. We held hearings. And the hearings were highly publicized. They got a lot of attention. It lasted 2 weeks, and then there was another week devoted to the Frank Serpico charges. And there was daily public television covered as daily, and then they did it again at night, repeated it, and then on the weekend they did the whole thing all over again. We were at the top of the local TV news and nationally. It was front pages in all the tabloids. The Times would give whole 2 and 3 pages of the testimony. And pardon me. We were invited to talk on the morning TV shows, and we were on the Dick Cavett show, which was like the Leno show of its time, for the whole show, just devoted to our commission. And I was going to be on the cover of Newsweek. And then, after 25 years of successfully keeping the Chinese out of the UN, they let them in my week. It's just as well. People made my life unbearable anyway, because and the New York Civil Liberties Union objected to what we were doing, as saying it was a circus, and the PBA said it was a circus, and to some degree they were right. But it was a circus that was intended to bring out in public the kind of thing that people had just not talked about. And I think the results were a change in attitude in the department. And the 80% that Frank Serpico talked about, that group of people who wanted to be honest actually became honest, so that the grass eaters took the opportunity of a changed attitude that was made possible by the publicity to some degree to in a different climate to become honest. Sidney Cooper was quoted in the New York Times this way. Pardon me. Talking about the police brass, he said, "Not very long ago we talked about corruption with all the enthusiasm of a group of little old ladies talking about venereal disease. Now there is a little more open discussion about combating graft as if it were a public health problem." That's the way he characterized the change. And shortly after our hearings, First Deputy Commissioner Smith, who, speaking for the commissioner, said this. He came out and he absolutely rejected the rotten apple doctrine by name. And he defined that doctrine as standing for the proposition that police departments are essentially free of corruption except for the presence of a few corrupt officers who have managed to slip into police service and also into key assignments such as gambling investigations, despite vigorously applied screening procedures designed to keep them out. Smith said that traditional police strategy had been to react defensively whenever a scandal arose by promising to crack down on graft to go after the rogue cops to get rid of rotten apples. And he said the department now rejected this approach. Not just on principle, he said, but because as a way of controlling corruption, it had utterly failed. He acknowledged that the result of adherence to the theory had been a breakdown in public confidence, and he said, they, the public, are sick of bobbing for rotten apples in the police barrel. They want an entirely new barrel that will never again become contaminated. Now, this was a substantial change in the message coming down from the top to the police, and I think it really took hold. Murphy was unleashed and was able to do the reforms that he wanted to do. He committed himself to aggressive enforcement. He had a field associate program whereby they would get trainees coming right out of the initially as they came on the department and tried to recruit them to be in IAD people, and the cops knew that. There was a concept of command accountability whereby you were held responsible for the actions of the people under you. So the sergeant couldn't say about the corruption of someone under him, gee, I didn't know about that. No, you're supposed to know about that. And you were disciplined for not knowing about it. Personnel records. When we came into our investigation, one cop, you had to go to 12 different places to find the records applicable to that cop, and 14 different files. Now, this is the days before computers, of course, but still, they got those records together so as to be able to focus better. A little simple recommendation that we made that was put in name tags. They didn't have name tags in those days. Just put a name tag on so that somebody can tell what the name of the cop was. And generally, disciplinary procedures were tightened up. Also, there were other enforcement efforts that came in at that time. The feds had been working on our cases. Bill Phillips had given, I think there were 31 indictments that resulted in from his testimony to a federal task force run by Mike Shaw, who was looking into those cases. Then Phillips himself was indicted for a murder of two people that occurred 4 years earlier and wound up doing 33 years. I still don't think he did it, but I'm biased. And then there was another player in the scene, and that was the special prosecutor. We had recommended that a special prosecutor be appointed, a special attorney general appointed by Rockefeller, the governor, and he was. And with jurisdiction over all 5 counties having to do with corruption in the criminal justice system in all of its aspects. It had 35 attorneys, it had 35 investigators, and it was a powerful operation. Unfortunately, the first special prosecutor was a fellow by the name of Maureen Najari, who went a little crazy, and for 3 years he really went on a rampage, which was totally out of line. He was replaced by John Keenan, who then and Rod Lankler, and ultimately by Joe Hines, who's now the DA in Brooklyn. And under Keenan and his successors, it became a very effective operation. And then it ran out of cash under Cuomo, and it was discontinued. I forget exactly when that was. Another thing that happened after the commission was that we recommended, and other people realized that it was a good idea, to remove temptation by getting the police out of the regulated industries that they meddled in: construction, bars, Sabbath, gambling, those things. In our report, we said, as a simple matter of efficiency, there is no justification for using the police with all their powers and prerogatives in the enforcement of many miscellaneous regulations. Well, what do you know? You don't mind if I take a call, do you? Sorry about that. It is ridiculous to have an armed police officer wasting his time and that of his partner and supervising sergeant checking restaurant washrooms to find out whether they are properly supplied with soap. We believe that the police should be taken out of bars and restaurants and away from building sites and return to their principal job of protecting lives and property. And that happened pretty much, as Ross really pointed out to me, because once this is over, for a long time, only what I heard is what I knew, but Ross pointed out that the enforcement in construction was given to another city agency, and the bars, so that there might still be corruption, but not among police officers. And that's important, because you can deal with that, and Ruth can deal with that in the DOI, but a cop should be something better than the rest of us. A cop should be the kind of person who has the idealism that most of them had when they went on the job. In sum, the meat eaters will always be with us. They're criminals. The only way you can get them is to catch them. There's going to be a certain percentage in any department, and you just got to have a good machinery to catch them. The grass eaters, the organized, open, condoned graft, I think just dried up. And that really, I don't think exists anymore. You can still be corrupt in the police department if you want to, but now you have to lie about it. You can't brag about it. Since then, since 1894 and the Seabury Commission, there's been what?
1930.
Pardon me?
1930.
1894. Since then, God bless it. If I knew how to turn the thing off, then I could do that. But that's another thing about being 40 years ago. It's a brave new world. Anyway, since then, since the late 19th century, every 20 years, there has been a police investigation, a scandal, something like that. And we came along, and then 20 years after us came the Mullen Commission. And the Mullen Commission, people say, well, the Mullen Commission came along, what'd you guys do? And I think, and I understand that, Ross, you're going to have another symposium another month from now with the Mullen Commission people. But I think we both made a contribution. I think we helped do away with that 80%, the grass eaters. The meat eaters, by the time Mullen came along 20 years later, they'd gotten worse because the drug culture had gotten worse. And as the drug culture got worse, cops, who themselves, a lot of them, just didn't want anything to do with drugs, they went along with it. And the Mullen Commission found, number one, that there were cops who were involved in selling drugs and actually competing with the criminals that they were supposed to control. And the machinery for handling this, the machinery for catching the crooks, had just broken down and was ineffective. And their recommendations led to reforms in the Internal Affairs Division, became the Internal Affairs Bureau, and I think that we did our job in kind of handling the grass eaters, and the Mullen Commission saw to it that the machinery for catching the meat eaters is in good shape. And I think now you have a situation where there really are no pads or organized graft, and IAB is very efficient. It is a little bit of a catch-22, as we've seen in the newspapers recently. If the police catch crooks, they're criticized because the crooks exist. But that doesn't necessarily mean the system isn't working. It means the system is working, maybe. So I think that we will always have a tension in an area where there is always temptation. God damn it. How do you shut this thing off? I'm through anyway. I might as well take the phone call. I would just say one last word that I did want to mention, and that is, I always felt back then and today that the best solution for corruption in a department is a strong, vigorous leadership. I always used to say, if you made General Patton or Vince Lombardi police commissioner, you wouldn't have any corruption. I mean, Paul Hornung, the halfback for Vince Lombardi, used to say, when the coach says sit down, you don't even look to see if there's a chair. Now, that kind of respect and that kind of control is something that is effective, and frankly, from my standpoint and vantage point, I think that's the kind of control that we have in the person of the current police commissioner. But who knows what tomorrow will bring. Now, if you want to answer that phone, Bruce, you just go right ahead. Thank you. Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah. Let me say a couple things. First, that as Mike said, I thought this topic was so interesting and the history so rich that we ought to do 2 sessions on it. So on Tuesday, March 20th, it's a Tuesday, not a Friday, March 20th, I have Harold Baird Jr. here, who was a member of the Mullen Commission, and Richard Davis, who preceded Mike and the Commission to Combat Police Corruption here in the city. And we'll talk about what followed from that. I also want to just introduce Anthony Crowell from the Mayor's Office, who's here, Rose Gilhern, Commissioner of Department of Investigation, thank you for being, and one of our speakers in past, David Frankel, Commissioner of Finance, and Councilmember Robert Jackson. Thank you for being here. We have microphones here for questions, short questions, because we don't have all that much time and maybe other people want to speak as well. You can go to the microphones. I want to say before the question that the Knapp Commission report is extremely readable, and one of the great things that Mike did is gets it all down in a powerful, powerful narrative. It makes good reading even today. Okay.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Frank Serpico has compared his actions to those of a more modern whistleblowing cop, Adrian Skullcraft, who was the subject of several cover stories in the Village Voice after he secretly recorded conversations in Brooklyn's 81st Precinct in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and was then taken against his will to a hospital and held for several days. When you were appointed to your present position as the head of the Mayor's Commission on Police Corruption, Leonard Levitt, the author of NYPD Confidential, reports that you said that there was no need to investigate the NYPD under Commissioner Raymond Kelly. My question to you is, given that statement, how are you in a position to investigate any corruption which may be taking place right now, and doesn't that call out for the creation of an independent agency to monitor and investigate the NYPD?
Well, if I'd said that, maybe. But I didn't say that, with all due respect, as we lawyers like to say, to Len. He has, I think, an agenda. And fine, he has his point of view. What I believe, what I mean, is that in good times, when you have a good police commissioner, when you've got a vigorous internal affairs bureau, it is you don't have the highly publicized corruption areas that cry out for investigation. Skullcraft, his charges were investigated, and police officers were disciplined as a result of the kinds of things that he had come out with. And in a much more subtle area, what you're talking about there is, did policemen, or do policemen give erroneous reports of crime in their area so as to make themselves look better? That's a long way from narcotics and murder and all the rest of the stuff that we found. And it's a long way from what Frank had found when he was in his plainclothes division, where you had the whole division dividing up graft and going out. It's a long way. It's a more subtle issue. Should it be handled? Sure. Should we be investigating? To the degree that we can, fine. And I am very happy that the mayor has just increased our staff to the point where we're able to do it. One of the problems in investigating things with well, first of all, our group, as our commission, doesn't have the authority to investigate. It is an oversight division, oversight unit. It's supposed to look at the police department and see, is the police department and are the DAs doing their job? After all, the issue of corruption is handled not just by IAB, but it's handled by 5 district attorneys, by the U.S. attorneys in the area. There are lots of people who are out there trying to make cases against corrupt cops. Our job is not to weigh in on that effort. Might be a good idea, but it just doesn't happen to be our job. Our job is to be an oversight to see what's going on. And I think that Ray Kelly and his chief of IAB, Charlie Campisi, and people like that, they are doing their best, and they're very good at it. Do things creep through? Sure.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for making me feel so young by saying I was in kindergarten when this commission took place.
Thanks a lot. I need this?
Okay. The quick question is, do you think that corruption had changed in certain ways? For example, the fact that underreporting of crime, and the reporting of something that was a felony is now being categorized as misdemeanor, something that's a misdemeanor is now being categorized as a violation. So do you see that happening? Like the Village Voice has reported repeatedly over the last few years about this. Do you see that kind of thing where the brass, rather than the policemen, are underreporting the kind of pressure to underreport crime? Do you see that happening?
Pardon me. We do not have currently, maybe we will, because the mayor has just increased our staff by 4. We have 4 new lawyers, bringing our staff up to 6. Our staff previous to that was 2 supervisory lawyers and 2, in effect, investigators who are paralegals. We really could do no more than just monitor the cases that were happening in IAB. As far as getting into any investigations or analysis of the kind of thing you're talking about, we really weren't able to. But that could be a problem. It certainly, there's a tendency. The other side of that coin is the Schoolcraft thing, where you got a captain saying you got to bring in 6 arrests by this Friday. Well, it's the kind of thing that it undoubtedly will go on and has to be handled administratively. As I say, it's a long, long way from what the Mullen Commission found with cops taking pipes and beating people, or what we had found about the graft that Frank Serpico reported. Maybe now that we have the extra 4 people, we'll see if we can come up with a better answer for you.
Mike, I'll make you feel somewhat younger. When you spoke at the new school years ago on the NAP Commission, I was in that class.
Thank you. Thank you.
But my question is, bringing it somewhat more up to date in your current work. For the past several years, IAB has really not had a permanent cadre. They have the new procedure that officers who want to move up through the ranks serve 2 years in IAB. My question is, if an officer really is going into IAB, not so much because he or she is dedicated to it, do you get that much production out of him or her? And also, since they only have to serve 2 years, basically in your report several years ago, it took them 6 months to learn how to do it. You get a year of good work from them, and then 6 months later they're signing off their files.
I really can't address that because I really don't know how long you have to be on the job to be effective. But I'll tell you this: the idea that people are drafted to be in IAB, the idea that they go in there temporarily against their will, if you will, aids tremendously in the respect that they are held in among their comrades. I mean, it is certainly understandable that the shoo-flies that in a police organization are not going to be respected and are not going to get the cooperation of the comrades that they are, as their comrades see, ratting on. But if it's a temporary thing that they're drafted to do, I mean, that's a deliberate device. I don't know. I do know this. Observing the IAB personnel, the people who are there and the people who are doing this, they appear to be a highly efficient and very dedicated group of people. We meet with the police commissioner once a month and get briefed. He gets briefed by IAB personnel on cases that we select to be reported to him, and we have our staff sits in on screening meetings where there's a constant effort within IAB to make sure that they keep their hands on the investigations and see that they are well run. I think it's important for an oversight body to say when things are going well as when things are not going well. And all I can say is that it appears to me that these people are dedicated in doing a job. And with my background in what I did here all those years ago, and as old as I am, I'm not looking around for any political position or anything. I have no reason not to tell the truth as I see it.
Understood.
And that's the way I see it.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you for coming to present. My name is Robert Jackson, and I chair the Education Committee on the City Council, and I co-chair the New York City Council's Black, Latino, and Asian Caucus. There are 27 members of us in the caucus. And amongst the caucus, some of the primary concerns is the whole stop and frisk situation that's going on currently, in which our Speaker, Christine Quinn, has written to Police Commissioner Kelly, along with the caucus, writing and communicating with Commissioner Kelly, along with the whole issue of what the other speaker spoke about as far as, communicating to individuals that they shouldn't file certain reports and or trying to downgrade reported incidents so that statistics in the precincts are not as high, especially with CompStat. And these are major concerns. And along with, I've spoken to police officers coming in, new recruits, and I've expressed to them how important it is that they, as individuals, follow the acronym on the side of the police vehicle, CPR, courtesy, professionalism, and respect. And I communicated with them that if in fact you see someone else, a police officer, doing something that's wrong, you need to pull them in check immediately, because it may have a negative impact on you and your employment and your job. So my question to you is, considering those matters which I just raised, along with counterterrorism and the number of personnel assigned to that, do you believe that there is enough police presence in order to deal with all of the street crime, the counterterrorism, and all of the things that we need to do, considering the fact that under Mayor Dinkins there were about 41,000 police officers, and now there's I think 34, maybe 2, something like that?
I don't know. I certainly, my current position as chairman of a group that is supposed to oversee the corruption aspect of the department, I would have no way of having any insight into the problems that you talk about. They're problems, but I would be foolish if I were to give an opinion that would be anything more than my own personal opinion.
Well, okay, let me just follow up on that as far as we talk about corruption. And in my opinion, as a layperson, and I'm not a police personnel, I don't know, in my opinion, I don't see widespread corruption in NYPD. Like anywhere else, there's a couple of situations in every organization. You look at the New York City Council, the state legislature, the federal government, Congress, everywhere. I guess there's always a few. I don't personally see that overall. And even though I chair the Education Committee, I've expressed loud and clear the most important thing for myself and my constituency is the safety and security of the people that I represent. So I'm concerned, obviously, about overall corruption, but I don't necessarily see that in NYPD. I'm more concerned as a legislator about all of the stop and frisk where 94% of the people are not even arrested. I'm more concerned about the street crime that is out there impacting the people that I represent. Those are my concerns overall, and about the whole situation as far as honesty and integrity with NYPD, with the Deputy Commissioner Paul Brown communicating as far as the third jihad, that Police Commissioner Kelly was not really involved in that, and later subsequently said that he was. He was interviewed for a long period of time about the fact that when my colleagues, in which they talked to me, Jamani Williams was detained, and the reports that certain things that someone hit a police officer and there was no proof and evidence of that. I'm concerned about the communication with honesty and integrity, because if in fact there's false information and you are the spokesperson, then there's a question as to your honesty and integrity. So I just bring that to your attention overall. That has a negative impact overall on NYPD, and I know you're not the commissioner. Thank you very much.
Right, I certainly am not. In what you have said, I take one thing that I think is really relevant to my observation, and that is that you do not think from your vantage point that there is a problem with widespread corruption in the department. No legislator, local legislator, could have honestly said that back in 1970.
Well, I want to bring this to a close, but before I want to make one comment, and that is just how important this topic is. Stay, Mike, stay. Don't go away. I was saying how important this topic is. We really want the police, we need the police to do their job. That is, they provide us the bulwark to our civilized life, and so this is such an important topic, and you contributed so mightily to the questions of, and challenges of police integrity, and we thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today. As we always like to do, we'd like to give a product of the scholarship at this law school to our speakers, and so I have two issues of the law review. One is the media and criminal law, fact, fiction, and reality TV, so that was related to yours, and second, school to prison pipeline symposium. These are both very important topics, and you have shared today memories and insights and analysis of one of the most important periods involving police integrity in the city of New York, and we thank you so much. We'll see you on March 20th on the Marlin Commission.